Hello, my name is Jesse Denson and I am a scientific journalist, and today we are looking at the cognitive costs of work addiction and the limits of the research lab. We've got a recent study for you today, the neuropsychological profile of work addiction by Christina Berta and colleagues. So when we think of a workaholic, do you imagine a high performer successfully completing tasks? Perhaps, but we have to remember that, like other addictions, there are consequences, especially when, in this case, work is coming before well-being. And so what this study raises the question of is, if work addiction behaves like other behavioral addictions, does it share similar cognitive detriments? Okay, so what is work addiction? So although it doesn't get formally recognized in the DSM-5 or ICD-11, researchers use this components model, which you can have a read of, to classify it. And you can think of work addiction as when work becomes central, difficult to stop, and pulling away from it feels almost dangerous. And this is really that work coming before well-being. In gambling addictions and substance addictions, researchers often look at these executive functions because of the alterations that we can see. And so in this study, we're looking at inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. So a little bit about this study. It had 101 participants, working adults. They were divided into high-risk addiction group and a low-risk addiction group using a single cutoff score based on the work addiction risk test, which is a test developed in 1989. And we will come back to this, but just have a little read of that top one, number 5. I stay busy and keep many irons in the fire. This test is a product of its time, but we will get back to it. So what else? We've got personality traits and measures, the BSI-21 and the FFOCISF, and you can have the read of the full names there, but these are assessing trait impulsiveness, compulsiveness, and obsessive personality traits. Right, next is inhibitory control. We've got the go, no go. In a modified version, I've tried to recreate it here as accurately as I could based on what was said in the study. We've got a 2x2 square with 4 stars in each. A P comes up, the participant has to press the button, and then it goes back to the stars, and then the next thing they might have an R show up, and in this case the participant is not to press the button, and then this is reversed in the second half of the test. Next, for cognitive flexibility, we've got a modified version based on the Wisconsin card sorting test. For example, in this situation, if we're basing the matching off shape rather than color, then A is the correct card. We also have 3 working memory tasks, starting with the digit span. So that's a sequence of numbers. It gets longer and so therefore harder to remember, recounting back to the researcher all of the numbers. The counting span, so it was described as having yellow and blue squares and having to count those quickly. And finally, the interesting one, the N-back tasks. So as you can see on the side there, 1 back target means that you've seen that previous letter on the previous slide, same letter. 2 back means you've seen that same letter 2 slides back. Right. What are the results? Well, the high-risk work addiction group performed worse in inhibitory control. So these participants had fewer correct responses and lower discriminability scores. In terms of working memory, there was a split. So the high-risk group performed better on the 1 back task, but the high-risk group performed worse on the 2 back task. In terms of cognitive flexibility, both groups performed comparatively pretty much the same. And in terms of personality measures, we have a higher risk group showing significantly higher impulsiveness and compulsiveness. Overall, evidence was pointing to specific not global, cognitive differences in these individuals in the higher risk group compared to the lower risk. And on the surface, this study seems pretty solid. I commend it for having a large battery of different measures to really test different cognitive executive functions. However, I want to pose the question, is this really the neuropsychological profile of work addiction that's being presented in the findings? Let's dive into some of the problems that I had with this study. Number one, and definitely the biggest problem I have with this study, is the fundamental measure is outdated. It's based on work in 1989, and I want you to think about how radically work has changed since 1989. Back then, being a workaholic probably meant staying late at the office. And for example, I've used this picture, which some of my generation might not even know that that's a pager, which was very common in the 90s. And today, work addiction is very internet shaped. So we've got problems such as responding to messages at midnight, work messages, managing multiple digital workloads, being reachable across different time zones. And so we start to see this barrier between work and home disappear. And what the wart can't do is assess digital over-engagement, remote work stress, or 24/7 connectivity. And therefore, this study is applying a pre-internet tool to really a deeply internet-shaped problem in the modern day. And therefore, if the foundational measure is outdated, then the cognitive patterns identified may not reflect modern work addiction. They may reflect a very narrow, older conceptualization of the phenomenon. What else? The second limitation is about the context. Work addiction in a real life situation, you've got emotional factors, there's pressure, there's relational factors of your relations to other co-workers, and for a visual representation, I've got here the representation of a lab scene versus perhaps what a real workstation looks like. And so this raises the question, do people who score high on the wart behave differently on lab-based executive function tasks? That's really what this study is testing, rather than do work-addicted people struggle cognitively while working, which is really what this study was aiming to look at. Coming back to that wart as an issue with this study. I commend the authors for also discussing that there could be other explanations, such as chronic overload, stress, burnout. These are all common in work addiction and can have an effect on these cognitive complex tasks. And so really we're missing some of the picture by not including these aspects into the analysis. Lastly, the paper interprets work addiction through a neuropsychological deficit model, which is valid, but it is very narrow. And for example, social cultural pressures such as the hustle culture that we have today is a factor that could be influencing that isn't accounted for in this study. And so we can't assume executive dysfunction is really the whole story. I've got some future directions, how we could really enrich this study in the future. Simulating real workplace factors like the stress and the emotional connections to different co-workers, putting this in more of a deeper context. Multitasking under pressure. We could test multitasking as a cognitive measure as well, seeing how that is affected. Using a smartphone to update throughout the day, real-time reports, so you can self-report while you're at work would be a really good way to get these results within the context of work. And we could also pair these sort of ideas over the long term to kind of see the longitudinal results and findings if they are valid over a longer period of time. Lastly, pairing these cognitive tests with physiological measures touched on before, but we've got stress biomarkers and heart rate, things like this to really ground this study in a richer context. So, while I do like this study, I think it's a valuable first step. I think we should be cautious with the conclusions. I think that a more modern assessment would be really important to having a very more accurate representation of work addiction. I think having a richer context, so having more simulated real life workplace factors to really ground this study in ecological validity, as well as looking at some of these other models so that we're not just focusing on the psychological aspect to this, we're also thinking about culture and emotion to really get a whole picture of work addiction in the modern day. Here are my references, and I would like to thank you for watching.